go first.
Go ahead and
Start.
Okay, so I sent out an email last week about mentors and mentees. Got a couple of responses. The only one that no one had sort of laid claim to was Jessica. Did any of you folks that didn't respond, any interest there, or just want to wait until we potentially bring in some other folks? Nobody?
I'll claim her too if she's up for grabs.
Greedy. That's all I'm just greedy.
I'll take it
You
too.
want all the members you can get. Okay. All right. So once again, next week after class on March 21st, we're going to be at the Royal Pig here on Las Olas, the same place we went to in December after the last day of class. All day next week. I think Kevin's going to be sending out an email sometime this week in terms of the details, but the plan is we're going to be in Miami all the morning, visiting a couple different projects there, and then back here in the afternoon and visiting a couple different projects, meeting with some folks, and then once again kind of finishing everything out. We're also inviting alumni and some of the members of the advisory board to this. Once again, it'll be just the same sort of thing. I'll take care of paying for the food and beverages. So, okay. Let us move forward. Today, what we're going to do, obviously from now until roughly 10 o'clock, or maybe a little bit before, depending on kind of where the questions sort of lead us, anything that you want to ask about the real estate finance test, okay? As I sent to you in the email, 10 conceptual questions, 10 problems. You probably, if you did a good job of just kind of going back and looking through the notes, could probably identify pretty quickly what those questions and problems should be. Just out of curiosity, so let's just sort of take the problems for a second. And without me saying anything, you tell me what you think the 10 problems are based on, topic-wise.
Mezzanine financing.
Okay, what?
ARMs?
What?
ARMs?
No.
Nice.
Graduated payment mortgage.
Refinancing?
Graduated payment mortgage.
Price level adjusted money. Plan? Some plan. Weighted average cost of capital.
Whack.
Financial leverage. Net future value.
Reverse mortgage.
Reverse mortgage. Incremental cost of borrowing.
Construction financing.
What? Securitization questions. I don't know that. That's all I got.
That's it.
That's pretty much it.
What's
Oh,
the
yeah.
incremental cost?
Well, interest rate buy downs, you mentioned, yeah.
Solving an interest rate buy down question is simple. I mean, similar to solving an incremental cost of
Yeah, it's
borrowing
basically,
question.
it's very similar.
Yeah.
Okay, so, is there anything, any of those that sort of pop out that you've got questions about, or you feel pretty comfortable?
Just take the test now.
Can we do the incremental what is that?
Incremental cost of borrowing?
No, the construction thing.
Okay.
Wasn't the construction more so conceptual?
Yeah, there's not actually a problem on the construction loan, but
Then don't worry about it.
You just want to know.
What's
I'm sorry,
GPO?
graduate payment mortgage? Okay. You have a specific question about it?
You want to go for number 4 in the last final?
I don't know that I've got a copy of it. Do you have a copy of it?
Yeah.
What is that, a GPM?
All right. Do it.
Oh,
Unless it's too close to the actual exam question.
let's just take the exam now and have like 4 hours for lunch.
Okay,
I got a good one. Just laugh it. Okay. Funny guy.
Okay. Who's the class? Those videos?
The sound, like you can hear me right now. Crystal clear.
Yeah, they're pretty good.
okay, so we've got a graduate payment mortgage, $100,000, 6% interest rate for 15 years. The payments are going to increase at 7.5% a year for the next 5 years. Is that correct?
Yeah.
For the next 5 years. Okay, so 5 years. And you're being charged 4 discount points up front, and you're asked to calculate what is the lender's yield after 7 years. Okay?
Okay.
All right, so the first thing you're going to do is sort of start off with 100,000 as our loan amount, 6% for our interest rate, 15 years, get our initial payment amount. Okay? And so I get $843.86 as the initial payment. So that is going to be, if we want to sort of look at this, so payment in year 1, year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. In year 1 is going to be $843.86. Everybody agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what we're saying is that it's going to increase at 7.5% for the next 5 years. Okay, so what are we going to do to get that increase? We're going to multiply this payment times 1.075. Okay, so doing that, so for the second year, it'll be 907, basically 15, rounded. Okay, everybody good? Okay, continue that process of multiplying it by 1.075. So the next year would be 975, 18. The next year, 104,832.
Doesn't it stop after that?
It stops after 5 years of increases.
Okay.
So the final change is here,
All right. Yeah. I get it.
46, 47, we round it. Okay, so it stops changing there. In other words, you've had 5 years of increases, okay, which gets you to year 6. Everybody good with that? Okay. Then it stops there. So year 7, you want to go ahead and just put it in there. 12, 11, 47. Okay, now, what it's asking for is what is going to be the lender's yield after that 7-year period, okay?
Are you putting that last number as the payment?
Well, I'm sorry?
Never mind, keep going.
Okay, so what we've got to do at this point is we've got to calculate, well, what is going to be our loan balance, but we've also got to calculate, well, what is the actual dispersal up front from the lender's perspective. Because up front,
100,000 minus the 4 points.
minus the 4 points would be $4,000, which would be $96,000 that the lender would actually disperse. Okay, and so that is going to effectively be your cash flow. If we want to sort of think about, let's just kind of put this in here. So we clear everything out. So we would put in 96,000. As a cash outflow. Then in year one,
So we're looking at this from the lender's perspective?
well, I'm sorry,
Yeah, that's
Okay,
what lenders yield.
Okay.
we're looking for the lender's yield, correct?
Yeah, I know. Keywords.
Okay.
Yeah, I was looking at it from the borrower's perspective, so.
Okay, 843.86. Oops, that's cash flow, oops. The next year, 907.15.
Oh, that's right, that's
Whoops.
Oh,
And
man,
we actually,
right.
Put the years in there?
that's what I was about to do. Caught myself. Okay. 12, shift N sub J.
It said it in the problem that there was it stopped after 5 years?
I'm sorry?
It said it in the problem that it stopped after 5 years?
I believe,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, 16.
12.
907.15.
That's for 12 months.
975.18. 104.832.
'Cause
Don't you like to start with zero CFJ?
Because 96,000 is your initial cash outflow. This is from the lender's perspective.
Oh, yes, got it. Again.
26.
This looks like a problem better suited for itself.
It's the same problem as solving.
So the last one, so why are you putting in the, like the future value there, the balance?
Why are you?
Yeah, because it's just saying calculate the lender's yield after 7 years. So is it assuming that you're paying it off?
That's a good question.
Because I looked at it as just
What's the yield up to that point?
up to that point.
Yeah, no, you could interpret it that way. So we can do it that way.
Just do it that way.
No, that's fine. We'll do it that way.
How will you find the balance then?
Well, the balance, yeah, that's going to be a lot more challenging because we've got to go back and adjust each year
Yeah.
and find the balance and then like restart. So it's
Right,
much
right,
more
right.
involved. So from that standpoint, this will make it actually a lot easier.
So we just stop after the last one.
So you just make that another 12.
So make that for 12 months and then just simply solve for. And what we get.
Nobody was doing that.
Start up, search.
on the last two.
Yeah.
Oh, NJ,
Sorry.
yeah, sorry.
Got it. She ready for this
I
test.
know.
Really, if you put it wrong, forget it. Wasted your time.
Yeah, that's why. Except for it's not right. When I was just thinking that whole time.
So it's like a negative return.
Yeah.
What?
Well, because you're not getting any of your principal back in that particular instance. The way, because we didn't say there was a loan payoff.
So if it said it was a payoff, we would probably get the balance first
Yes.
before we go to start that.
Listen.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so,
Anything else?
Wait, just to clarify it though, we would have to get the balance and adjust the increase in the payment each time, right?
Mark.
What that'd be.
It's a lot more complicated than
Yeah,
that.
that's interesting.
Number 3 is the one
Okay.
that we couldn't figure out.
Yep.
Don't worry about it.
No?
That was the
I said don't worry
construction.
about it.
Oh, he said not to worry about it? Oh.
Which one? What was
Number
it?
3,
With the points, with the
the constant amortization portion,
No, we already did that.
right? Okay.
Okay, anything else?
Do we have to know 13?
I don't have that in front
Oh,
of
you
me.
have it with you.
What is it?
The one with the, it's a 3-year term and offers 3 months free of rent? We did that last month.
That'd be the exam from what?
The last final.
Example.
You know what? I should have given you a question like that on the test. I forgot about it.
Okay, I studied those.
If you want to throw that one in there last minute, it's all for it. Let's go.
Maybe I can make that a bonus question.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, anything else?
But still, like a practice.
Yep.
Oh,
Any particular aspect?
No, just run through one.
oh
Okay, if you remember, you have an overall sort of project rate of return. We sort of said that, this is kind of that whole weighted average cost of capital sort of stuff kind of rolled into this as well. And that is typically made up of your cost of debt, your cost or return on equity, and then the loan-to-value ratio, and effectively your percentage equity. All right? And so let's say that your cost of debt is 5%, and your cost of equity is, let's say, 15%, and your loan-to-value ratio is 75%, meaning the remainder would be equity, which would be 25%. So to calculate the overall project rate of return, so the overall project rate of return would be 7.5%, okay? So that would be the project's effectively weighted average cost of capital. Now, what we're effectively also sort of showing is that the project, if we sort of kind of work at it from another angle, and we sort of say that the project has this rate of return of 7.5%, and our cost of debt is lower than the overall project rate of return, which it is, it's 5%, then that gives us a positive financial leverage with respect to what our return on equity is going to be. And so that is why, and then if you come over here, then you would see that our return on equity is dramatically higher than both the cost of debt as well as the project rate of return. So it's simply a way to effectively magnify your rate of return on equity by virtue of having low cost debt, okay? And so the idea from financial leverage point of view is, as a general rule, you want to be able to borrow as large of a dollar amount as you possibly can, as high of a loan to value ratio as you possibly can, if you have a really low cost of debt that will only help to magnify that rate of return. So if, for example, we were to go in and we were to say, well, what if instead of a 75% loan to ratio, we were actually able to get a 90% loan to ratio, all right? What would that do, assuming we still have an overall project rate of return? Because the thing to keep in mind is the project itself is going to yield whatever the project itself is going to yield simply based on the cash flows, okay? So, this is, a rate of return based on effectively net operating income, which is before you take into consideration the capital structure of the debt and the equity, all right? So, by doing that, we would come over here, and we're going to be solving now for the return on equity, but our percentage equity has dropped, to where it's now only 10% of the capital structure, okay? Since instead of borrowing 75%, we're now borrowing 95%, meaning instead of putting in 25%, we're only having to put in 10% equity. So if we back solve, we're going to find, without even having to do the math, that this rate of return on equity now is going to be even higher than that 15%, and that is due to the financial leverage. So let's do that real quick, all right? So first of all, I'm going to do the math for
30%.
You get 4.5, and then if we subtract 7, we take 7.5 minus 4.5, that gives us 3 for here. Then we back solve, take that 3 divided by 10, and that's going to give us 30% now as our return on equity. So that is an example of financial leverage, that just by adjusting our loan to value ratio from 75 to 90%, doing nothing else, the project is the same, still generating the same rents, nothing has changed with the project, we have been able to now double our return on equity. Okay, does that make sense? And so that is an example of financial leverage in its most purest form, is that you can begin to see now why a lot of developers and investors want to do everything they can to maximize the amount of debt they take out on a property to be as highly leveraged as they possibly can be, because that's only going to work toward them getting the overall highest rate of return on the money that they've invested. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Where did you get the 90? You provided it to us, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, Daryl?
So, if they didn't provide us with the project ROR, how would we find the rate of equity?
You can't.
There was a question like that.
No, well, it may have been, in other words, you're gonna have to be given a couple of different pieces of information. You're gonna have to be given either the loan to value ratio or the percent on equity, and then you've got to obviously make it total up to be 100%. Okay, that's one piece of information you would have to be given, and you would have to be given then 2 of the 3 of either project rate of return, cost of debt, or return on equity. You're going to be given 2 of the 3 of those in order to solve for the third. Okay? Make sense? All right. Other questions?
Another area. Let's see.
So that's pretty much, that is a weighted average cost problem.
It is a way, but it's also a financial leverage.
Okay.
Because, I mean, ultimately, it's all interrelated.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, can you explain the difference, because it looked like whack to each other.
Well, it's both, because financial leverage is just simply, simply stated, financial leverage occurs when your cost of debt is lower than the overall project rate of return. Anytime that your cost of debt is lower than the overall project rate of return, you are going to have positive financial leverage. You would have negative financial leverage, meaning a bad thing, if it was reversed. If this were, let's say, 5%, and this were 7.5%, then that means your return on equity is not going to be good. It could actually, in some cases, be negative. Okay? And that's the downside of financial leverage, is that you may take on a project, and let's say the project currently has been yielding 7.5%. But what happens if all of a sudden at some point in the future the rents go down on the project, or your operating expenses increase on the project? That's going to lower this project rate of return. If it gets lowered to a point less than your cost of debt, that means you're going to have to make up the difference out of pocket, meaning your rate of return is going to go down dramatically to the point of, like I said, it could be a negative rate of return. Does that make sense? Or negative leverage.
How did you get the 0.30 then?
Okay, so once again, we had this, so we multiply that out, we got 4.5. 7.5 minus 4.5 gives us 3. We take 3 divided by 10, gives us 0.3 or 30%. Okay? All right, any other questions? So who are we missing? Anthony, and then Irene, Maricela? Anybody else? Is that it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So missing, there's a 14th one. Who are we missing?
Fred's not in the class.
Who?
Fred.
Yeah, he's not in the class though.
He's usually here at your account.
No, there's 14 on the class roll. That's what I'm going off of.
Juan will come eventually. He usually walks in late.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, under the bus. Oh my gosh. He just backs up.
Okay, so Dustin, Daryl, Mark, Tyler, Laura, Juan, Denzel, Marcel, Robert,
I'm
Jermaine.
gonna need that.
Oh. No. All right. So any other questions? Or y'all just want to go ahead and start the test? Yep.
Can we do mezzanine financing?
Okay. What do you want to know about mezzanine financing?
I mean, what information would you be giving us?
Okay. So mezzanine financing, tell me what it is.
It's a second mortgage.
Okay. Basically a second mortgage.
And is the cost between the debt and the ROE?
Equity.
And the equity, right?
Yep. So typically mezzanine financing, also called gap financing.
Oh, okay.
Okay, same thing. It's just some people
So, yeah.
choose to call it, but it's just that sort of in between. And mezzanine, it's kind of interesting because if you think about the origin of the word mezzanine, think about hotels, and you remember like in a hotel you have like a first floor, like a lobby, and then you have a mezzanine, which is typically that in between floor, and then usually above that is where they begin the rooms, but it's a middle ground is all it really is. And so, but the whole idea behind it is usually it's kind of a hybrid source of financing. Some mezzanine lenders will treat it purely as a second mortgage, purely as debt, give you the money, but expect a higher, obviously cost than the traditional debt, and no real strings attached. Other mezzanine lenders it gets treated more almost as equity in the sense that they want then some control over how the project runs. They want control over effectively any checks that get written out of the accounts. They want to have some sort of an approval in that. They also may offer up, management advice and information to the project developer, investors. So the sources of that mezzanine financing, in the sense of how much involvement they want with the project, can vary dramatically. Now, what can be done?
Just a quick question before you do that. As a developer, how would you look at mezzanine financing? As equity or debt?
Like I said, just as I said, it can be either or. I mean, because from the developer's perspective, in a perfect world, yeah, you'd love for it to be just treated as traditional debt, because no one's going to then be getting into your business about what you're actually doing with the project. Whereas, if it gets treated more as equity, then there may be that constant oversight that sort of comes into play, which is not inherently a bad thing. It's just that, well, what happens if there's a disagreement, and how progressive are your sort of mezzanine lenders? Because imagine, because the source of mezzanine financing, it's not as defined or as regulated as the other sources of financing. So a mezzanine lender could just be you, or you, or you. Each of you have different personalities, different backgrounds, different, sort of perspectives on how maybe a project should be operated and that sort of thing. So whenever you start contributing maybe a couple of $1 million toward a project in mezzanine funding, your perspective may be, I want to just sit back, let the cash roll in, don't really want to have anything to do with it whatsoever, and just collect my checks. You, on the other hand, may want to literally be watching over their shoulder every single move they make, constantly offering your sort of opinion and perspective on things, and and having that level of involvement. Does that make sense? Because it's like I said, it's not, no two mezzanine players are in essence identical in terms of what they want and kind of how they're going to want to structure it. But most of the time, if you had to generalize, a lot of mezzanine players want to be in and out within typically 3 to 5 years. So in a number of cases, they may match up to whatever commercial loan that you've got on the project. So in other words, if you have a 5-year commercial loan on the project with a balloon note at the end of 5 years, in many cases that mezzanine financing may match up with that as well, so that at the end of the 5 years you've got to pay them off as well with a balloon note.
Yeah, they're part of it.
Right. Whereas maybe other mezzanine lenders, in the event that maybe you have a mortgage that is a full 30-year mortgage, no balloon payments, that mezzanine player may still want to be out after 5 years. So you may either have to make larger payments up front, over that 5-year period, or come up with the cash at the end of 5 years to pay them off.
Some of them, like if you approached it and they're giving you debt for the project, and at the end of your 5 years you can't come up with all of that balloon payment, can they then sort of transition into equity? And
they could. I mean, theoretically, there's nothing really prohibiting them. I mean, other than whatever the agreement is that they've come up with, with you. And in some cases, it could even be, a structure that the mezzanine lender, as I was saying, becomes more of an equity player, in that they not only are trying to get involved in the actual management of the project, but could also sort of say, okay, we want this fixed percentage of income over, whatever 5 years, but we also want kind of an equity kicker, or we want, maybe whenever the 5 years is up, to assess the value of the property at that time, and then give that mezzanine player a percentage of that equity valuation, so that if the property, let's say, increased in value from $1 million to $2 million, you may have to give them theoretically maybe 5%, 10% sort of an equity kicker at the end to sort of as additional compensation. Kind of as like almost like a shared appreciation sort of mortgage kind of thing. Okay? Other questions? Yep. Oh.
Can you run through one thing?
Okay. All right, so assume that we've got a loan of $100,000 at a 10% interest rate for 30 years. We get our monthly payment, I just happen to know this from memory, $877.57. Okay. Current interest rates might be, let's say we're at 5%. Okay, so let's figure out what the payment's going to be on a 5% interest rate. It's going to be $536.82. The difference between the two is $340.75. And so now the form of the question could come from a variety of angles. One angle that it comes from is, all right, so how many months might I need to own this property in order for it to justify me refinancing? Okay. Now, in this particular instance, there's no cost associated with the refinancing. Okay, there's no additional fees, no additional charges. And so, it's a fairly, straightforward thing. So literally, it's the kind of thing that it would pay for itself instantly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, but if there are additional costs that you're going to, like for example, let's say that there's a $5,000 fee for refinancing, then we would have to sort of say, well, how many months would I need to own this property in order to justify this basically cost savings, okay? And so so if we said there was a $5,000 fee, we would put that $5,000 in as our present value. We would put the $340.75 as the payment. And in this case now, the question then becomes, and I would provide you with this, would we use the 10%? Would we use the 5%? Okay? And, from the standpoint of trying to figure out, are we looking at it purely conservatively, or are we trying, in other words, what's the range kind of value? So it's going to be somewhere in between probably the 10% and the 5%. So let's just start with using the 10% for a second. So if we use the 10%, but it's really truly based upon your your opportunity cost, okay? But let's say we use the 10% as the interest rate, then we should be able to solve for in or the number of months, okay? So in this case, and what we end up with is 15.71 months. Now, if we had used 5% instead, Doesn't change a whole lot. 15.17 months. Okay? So, roughly we can say 15 months. Okay, make sense?
And you say you would ask which one?
Yeah, I would tell you, well, which one you're gonna use. Or which one to base it off of.
Can you explain the logic behind that?
Which
That
one?
second part, the 5,000.
What? Okay, here, if this is your cost of refinancing, in other words, your lender has told you, in order to refinance, I'm gonna charge you a $5,000 refinancing fee, okay? Then what you're trying to do is you're trying to determine how many months would I have to continue owning this property in order to generate enough of a benefit, financial benefit, to justify that refinancing. And so all we're saying here is that you would need to own that property for another 16 months, well, 15.71, but roughly 16 months
For
in
the
order to break
refinancing
even
to be worth it.
on the refinancing. So if you had an intent that you're gonna move out within 12 months, or you're maybe gonna refinance again after 12 months or whatever, then it really wouldn't make sense to do this,
Okay.
is all we're saying.
And that's because of that $5,000.
Correct.
Refinancing.
Yeah, because if there's no cost to refinancing, in other words, your lender just says, doesn't cost you a penny, nothing out of pocket, we're just gonna lower your interest rate, well, that's obviously a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Very seldom does that happen. I mean, there are instances where it happens, but very seldom, is it that easy. Usually there's some sort of fee or charge or, something that gets attached to that because of if nothing else, the sheer amount of paperwork that has to be done to process something like that.
Yeah.
Just to make sure I have this, so you could ask something like, if they're willing, if they're looking to move in 12 months, is it worth, like, refinancing?
Yeah, or I would simply ask, well, how many months would you need to own the property in order for you to break even on the cost of refinancing? Okay.
Every time there's a loan origination fee, you always subtract it from the present value, right?
We use, yeah, subtract, because just from the standpoint of the dispersal of funds.
So we would sound like if that problem would say there's a 4% origination fee, we would, from the 100,000, we would subtract the 4,000, correct?
If you're trying to look at the effective cost of borrowing, which is different. Because that's a whole different kind of problem. This, we're just simply looking at what is the transactional cost of going from one loan to another loan. We're not looking at it from the lender's yield perspective at all. Daryl?
Why do you put plus or minus under the 340?
Because technically, I mean, it really in one sense almost should be the other way around, but the point being is, anytime that you have a cash outflow or you have a cash inflow, you should designate it as such. Now, really from the lender's perspective, that's kind of how this one is sort of set up. The lender is getting $5,000 cash money from you. So to the lender, that's a $5,000 inflow, and they are losing, the lender is losing $340.75 each month by you refinancing. So therefore, that is an outflow to the lender. Does that make sense? Or a loss to the lender. But to you, technically, if we wanted to set it up purely just from your perspective as the borrower, we could just switch it. And by doing that, it's not going to change the answer, okay?
So why do you calculate it at 10% and at 5%?
Just simply to show the range, because really what it should be based off of is your opportunity cost of funds.
Be the difference between.
Yeah, and so, it's one of those things that you could sort of say, well, my opportunity cost of funds is at, based on what I can invest in the market. And so from this standpoint, I just sort of say, okay, you can do both, or I would just simply give you one to base it off of.
Okay.
Okay? Yep.
So, I've got a residential property that, I was trying to see if it was worth refinancing. My mortgage on it now is 2.75 interest, but it's adjustable.
Yep.
And for me to refinance it for, I would rather have a fixed rate. It's at 4.25.
No?
So, it's difficult to look at it, because now I just look at, well, how much is it gonna cost me? But I'm taking the range between 2.75 and 4.25. Like, how should I really look at that? Not knowing what the future.
And that's a much more difficult sort of problem, because you don't know what the future is going to hold in terms of, like for example, if you were to wait until your adjustable rate mortgage increases to, 4.5 or whatever percent, but then also the fixed rate is, always going to be higher than that. I would argue, there's no doubt interest rates are going up. We know that. It's going to happen. We don't know when. Is it going to be this year? Is it going to be next year? I would have thought it would have happened before now. That's the thing. All of us have our speculation as to what's going to, and when it's going to happen. But from your standpoint, I philosophically right now would feel much more comfortable locking in a fixed rate mortgage, because I do think that, the increase is going to happen. It may not happen super quickly, but it's going to happen. So I don't know if that, and I'm sure you've already sort of thought that same sort of thing, but it's not
It's not like a problem where, I was just figuring out, obviously there's going to be some expense in refinancing, but it's all out of pocket. There's no benefit to refinance.
Right. Because you're going to be paying. If you automatically start, you could start off by just sort of doing the calculations of, well, what is my payment going to be with the 2.75? What is it going to be with the 4.5? And see what the dollar amount difference is there. Look at what the cost of the refinancing is, and sort of say, well, how many months is it going to take me to just recover that aspect of it? And doing. But the reality of it, it's not even a savings. It's an extra out of pocket. So from that standpoint, it's just you add them together.
But then I started looking at let's say next year it moves up by 50 basis points, and then the next year it moves up a quarter point, and then try to see at what point payback period.
Because the other thing that I would be thinking, for me personally, now is this like a rental property?
Yeah, it's rental.
See. The thing that we'd be going through in my mind is, how high could that rate go before I potentially would start losing money? In terms of what is the rental income the property is generating relative to what are the expenses, relative to what is that payment, and then kind of look at it from that perspective and say, well, how much wiggle room do I have before, in other words, if I were to lock in a rate of 4.5%, am I still going to be making positive cash flow? And if the answer is yes, then I would probably say, go ahead and lock in that 4.5%. Take a little bit of a hit now, but because you may not have a whole lot of tolerance. Depending on how leveraged you are in the deal, that if it were to go to 6-7%, which hopefully it's not going to happen for quite a while, but if it were, then that could very well put it in negative cash flow territory. Just to a certain sense, how risk adverse are you, but also, how much you want to, keep those extra few dollars in your pocket currently.
And doesn't that also factor in your perspective on whether or not that interest rate is going to jump quickly versus whether it'll just
incrementally go up?
Go slowly and slowly, because then at some point, if you lock in 4.75 now, but yet it takes 6-7 years before then you did kind of lose
you're
some
out of
money.
pocket a lot.
Yeah.
When you look at them.
And that is part of the downside of this sort of thing, is just all of the fundamentals that and you heard every single speaker say pretty much the same thing. We all agree interest rates are going up, but none of us can pin it down as to, well, is it going to be 6 months from now? Is it going to be a year from now? Is it going to be 2 years from now? But we all would have said that a year or 2 years ago. But the Federal Reserve has been kind of so concerned the economy is so fragile that they don't want to raise the interest rates, because the moment they do, that is going to have a dampening effect on whatever is going on, they don't want that.
They've also said that there's a lot of pressure on them to keep it, or at
Yes.
least go slow with it, so.
Right. So, that, you know, and there's, I don't know, you know, how else to sort of express that. It's just, it's, you know, there's nothing magical or mystical about it other than when is it gonna happen?
Yeah.
So from a modeling perspective, you basically just have to choose a best case timeline, a worst case timeline, based on assumptions, and
Yeah.
go from there.
I say give yourself a trigger point. Once it crosses at some point, then you start looking at it.
Because, well, the other thing that you potentially have working, that could be working against you at some point, is if the banks go through a whole series of loan defaults, again, they stop lending. And they're gonna, even though, you know, effectively the money is there, you follow what I'm saying? And so in other words, you could sort of get stuck with not being able to refinance.
Yeah.
So that's another, you know, aspect that you have to kind of, you know, factor in, you know, whereas the beauty of, you know, locking it in now for, you know, the next however many years, you know, might make some sense. But it also depends on your holding period. I mean, are you really honestly planning on holding this, you know, for however many years, or, you know, is this something that, you know, once again, you want to try to cash out of in the next 5 years? That also would be a big
That would be a
impact.
big impact.
Okay, other questions? Okay, well, once, twice,
I have one question.
okay.
In the exam on midterm, the final, question 16, I don't know if you already talked about it.
What is it?
It's on the exam.
Okay, do you have a, I don't have a copy of it.
I have it here. In question 16.
Not that one, no.
I'm gonna go to the restroom then, just in case.
I think, yeah, I've got an extra. Okay, so, sounds like that you guys are ready. So in this case, you'll get a little extra time to take the test. So if you want to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start the test.
We use our excerpts, like written pages out of our notebook, so we can have some scratch paper.
Just right on the back of the test.
Okay.
All over.
Very small.
Dustin.